What if everything you've been taught about God, reality, and your soul was designed not to awaken you, but to keep you asleep? What if the most powerful book in Western spirituality was never meant to be part of mainstream religion, not because it lacked truth, but because it revealed too much? And what if that book has just found its way into your awareness, because you're ready? There are moments in life when something stirs inside you, subtle, quiet, but unmistakable, a feeling that you've been living in a story too small for your soul, that beneath the noise of your daily thoughts, there's a deeper voice calling you. And if you're here, listening to these words, chances are you've already heard that voice. Maybe you couldn't name it. Maybe you've tried to silence it with distractions, with logic, with routine. But something always brings you back to the mystery, to that sacred discomfort, to the silent knowing that there's more to this life than what you've been told. This video isn't for everyone, and neither is the book we're about to explore, because the Corpus Hermeticum doesn't give you easy answers. It doesn't give you a doctrine to memorize or a god to fear, or a ritual to perform for approval. It gives you something far more dangerous, a mirror that reflects not who you think you are, but what you've always been, behind the amnesia of the ego. And that's the first shock, the realization that your forgetting was not accidental, that you were born into a world that rewards sleep and punishes awakening, a world that feeds you ideas of sin and shame and separation, but hides the ancient truth that you were never meant to crawl. You were meant to create, to radiate, to remember. The Corpus Hermeticum has been called many things: heresy, mysticism, pseudoscience. It has been exiled from churches, buried in libraries, dismissed by academics. But it has also been protected by those who knew that it contained a spiritual technology, a vibrational key, a sacred map that could reawaken a sleeping humanity. This book doesn't just speak of the divine, it speaks from the divine. It doesn't describe God as a figure on a throne judging from afar, but as the very essence of life pulsing within you, a field of intelligence so vast that it created galaxies, and yet so intimate that it breathes through your own thoughts. The corpus doesn't ask you to worship, it calls you to embody. It doesn't command you to obey, it invites you to remember. And it's this remembrance that threatens the foundations of everything built on control. Because once you truly know that the spark of the divine mind, the nous, lives inside you, you no longer seek outside. You no longer bow to false idols. You no longer live from fear. You become sovereign. And sovereignty cannot be controlled. That is why this text was hidden. Not because it was irrelevant, but because it was too powerful. And maybe that's why you've never heard of it until now. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like this world isn't your real home? Like you're living in a dream layered over something deeper? Have you ever sensed that you were meant for something more, but couldn't quite name what it was? That is the remembering. That is the pull of the nous, the divine mind, gently nudging you to wake up. This book isn't here to give you something new. It's here to strip away everything false so the truth can rise. It will challenge you. It will confuse you. It will contradict everything your conditioned mind wants to believe. But it will also do something else. Something no other book quite manages to do. It will recognize you. You'll read a sentence and suddenly feel it vibrating in your chest. You'll hear a phrase that unlocks something that's been dormant for years. You'll cry without knowing why. You'll stop searching for explanations and start breathing in revelation. That is the language of the Corpus Hermeticum. Not linear, but symbolic. Not intellectual, but initiatory. Not spoken to your mind, but spoken through it, to something deeper, something ancient. And here's what you need to understand. You were never meant to just read this text. You were meant to feel it, to absorb it, to let it tear open the layers of conditioning and forgetfulness that have wrapped around your soul like heavy cloth. You were meant to encounter it the way a soul encounters fire, not with analysis, but with awe, because the moment you let it in, everything begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as a collection of traumas and achievements. You begin to sense your existence as part of a greater pattern, a sacred geometry that pulses through the stars and the silence between thoughts. You begin to live not from reaction, but from resonance. You realize that the mind is not your enemy, it's your instrument. And when it's tuned to the divine, it becomes the gateway to co-creation. The Corpus Hermeticum begins not with commandments, but with a revelation. That all is mind. That reality is a projection. That the visible world is the echo of an invisible pattern. that your soul descended into this world not to suffer, but to awaken from suffering, and that the moment you align with that knowing, you begin the path of return. But the return isn't backwards. It's not regression. It's resurrection. It's the rebirth of the real self beneath the illusions. And yes, this path will require you to die. Not in the physical sense, but in the most sacred way possible. You will die to the false self, the conditioned self, the self that clings to safety, comfort, roles, and names. You will burn through layers of identity to reclaim the one thing that was never lost, your essence. And here's where the paradox deepens. The Corpus Hermeticum doesn't promise you enlightenment in the distant future. It invites you into presence now, into silence, into stillness, into that sacred space where truth doesn't need to be proven. It simply is. And it's there, in that silent space, that the remembering begins. You remember that your breath is sacred, that your body is not an obstacle, but a temple, that your thoughts are not random, but magnetic, that your life is not a series of accidents, but a living initiation, that your soul is not broken, but buried beneath noise. And as you remember, the world begins to respond. Not because the world changed, but because your perception finally aligned with what's always been true. The veils lift, the patterns reveal themselves, the synchronicities intensify, and what once felt like chaos starts to feel like choreography. This is not magic. This is alignment. This is the power of the Corpus Hermeticum, and this is the invitation of this video. You won't find sensational secrets here. You'll find sacred truth. You won't find step-by-step formulas. You'll find vibrations encoded to awaken. You won't find someone to follow. You'll find the reflection of the master within. And if that calls to you, if you feel the fire starting to glow behind your ribs, and then keep going, because what you're about to experience isn't a teaching, it's a transmission, a remembrance of something your soul already knows. Let's begin. Hermes Trismegistus, a name whispered in the shadows of temples, etched into ancient manuscripts, and invoked in the silence of spiritual awakening. But who, or what, is Hermes Trismegistus really? And why does his voice still echo across the centuries, reaching us now, when the world seems more asleep than ever? You won't find him in your history books. He's not a figure you can pin down to one date, one culture, one religion. That's because Hermes was never just a man. He is a symbol, an archetype, a spiritual current. And once you recognize what he represents, everything begins to shift. He is called thrice great for a reason. 3 times master, 3 times initiated, 3 realms of wisdom: alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, mind, soul, and spirit. Hermes doesn't just belong to the past. He belongs to the inner world of those who seek truth beyond the veil. To the Greeks, he was Hermes, the messenger of the gods, lord of the crossroads, the one who moves between worlds and carries divine language into human form. To the Egyptians, he was Thoth, scribe of the gods, guardian of wisdom, keeper of the cosmic order, the one who recorded the decrees of the divine into the book of life. When these 2 mythic figures merged in the mystical imagination of the ancient world, they gave birth to a new being, Hermes Trismegistus, a fusion not of names but of forces, the convergence of intellect and intuition, speech and silence, thought and eternity. But this is not just myth, it's memory. Because Hermes Trismegistus is more than a figure in old texts. He is a living principle, a presence that arises whenever a human being begins to awaken to their divine origin. He appears not with fanfare, not with fire from the sky, but as a subtle recognition, a deep, undeniable sense that there is something ancient within you, waiting to be remembered. Hermes is the voice between worlds, not a prophet, not a savior, but a mirror. He stands between the divine and the human, not to separate them, but to remind us they were never apart. That's why the Corpus Hermeticum exists. It isn't a religion. It isn't a rule book. It's a series of dialogues between Hermes and his students, reflections of consciousness awakening to itself. And the way Hermes speaks in these dialogues, it's unlike anything else. He doesn't lecture. He doesn't argue. He initiates. He invites. His words are less about transferring information and more about activating remembrance, because true wisdom doesn't arrive from outside. It emerges from within. Hermes is the spark that lights the inner fire. Across centuries, seekers have encountered this archetype in many forms, in the alchemical labs of Renaissance Europe, in the secret teachings of the Rosicrucians, in the esoteric symbols hidden in art, architecture, and ancient scrolls. He was there when Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum under orders to stop working on Plato, because Hermes' voice couldn't wait. He was there when Giordano Bruno defied the Inquisition, claiming that Hermes spoke of an infinite universe animated by divine intelligence. He was there when Carl Jung rediscovered alchemy not as superstition, but as the symbolic language of the soul's transformation. All of them, in their own way, were touched by the same current. Because Hermes doesn't appear to the masses, he speaks to the ready. And readiness doesn't come from academic study. It comes from inner alignment, from the silent scream of a soul that no longer fits in the world of illusion, from the deep ache to remember what you are beneath the masks. Hermes speaks to that ache. He doesn't give you answers. He gives you presence. A presence that dissolves your questions not by solving them but by making them irrelevant. He reminds you that the journey is not forward or backward, but inward. And when you begin to truly listen, not just with your ears but with your essence, you realize something astonishing, that Hermes is not separate from you. He is the part of you that has always known, the one who observes while the rest of you forgets, the one who stands quietly at the threshold of your awareness, waiting for you to turn inward and say, I'm ready. Ready for what? For the truth that you are not a being seeking the divine. You are the divine, seeking to remember itself through this human life. Hermes is the voice that bridges that gap. He is the sacred breath between thought and silence. He is the consciousness that refuses to collapse into identity. And in every line of the Corpus Hermeticum, he speaks directly to the part of you that cannot be destroyed, cannot be manipulated, cannot be bought or sold. He speaks to your immortality, to the seed of eternity planted in the soil of your temporary form. That's why the teachings have endured, not because of their popularity, but because of their potency. They are not concerned with fitting into culture or tradition. They are concerned with breaking the trance. Because the greatest illusion is that you are separate from the source. Hermes breaks that illusion, not with violence, but with light, not with commandments, but with clarity, not with fear, but with fire. He calls you to remember that you were not born to obey, but to embody. You are not here to escape the world, but to transform it, from the inside out. And that transformation begins the moment you stop seeking the teacher outside and recognize that Hermes is already within you. So read his words, not as history, but as initiation. Because you are not just a student of these teachings, you are their continuation. Hermes Trismegistus is not a myth to study. He is a frequency to become, a state of being that transcends time, language, and belief. And now, as the world forgets again, as the noise rises and the systems fracture, he returns, not in form, but in flame, in those who remember, in those who carry the light forward, in those who dare to embody what they once only read. And if you feel that flame, you already know. You've heard the voice between worlds. Now it's your turn to answer. Truth rarely walks through the front door. It travels in whispers, hidden in footnotes, veiled in allegory, buried beneath centuries of distortion, denial, and design. And nowhere is this more true than in the story of the Corpus Hermeticum, a text not lost by chance but deliberately concealed. Its disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. Because this book doesn't simply talk about God. It doesn't describe the soul in metaphors. It doesn't offer a system of beliefs. It does something far more dangerous. It reminds you who you are. It dissolves the illusion of separation. It exposes the false scaffolding of dogma. It hands you back the power you were taught to fear, and that could not be tolerated. To understand the forbidden journey of the Corpus Hermeticum, we have to go back, not just through history, but through memory, past the Renaissance, past Alexandria, past even Egypt. We must return to the threshold where language was still sacred and reality was still known to be a mirror. You see, the Hermetic texts emerged from a culture that understood something we have long forgotten, that the universe is not a machine. It is a mind. That matter is not dead. It is dreaming. That every form hides a vibration, Every name hides a force. Every myth hides a map. In that world, words were spells. Symbols were alive. The transmission of wisdom was not academic. It was alchemical. The Corpus Hermeticum wasn't written to be analyzed. It was composed like sacred music. Each line, each metaphor, was designed to bypass the intellect and awaken the soul. But as the centuries passed, something shifted. The sacred became superstition. The mystical was marginalized. The feminine was buried. And the collective mind turned outward, toward empire, conquest, and control. Religions hardened into rules. Spirituality became obedience, and the wild, luminous truths of the ancient world were swept aside for a narrative that served authority. And in this new order, Hermes had no place. The teachings of the Corpus Hermeticum posed a profound threat, because they didn't require temples. They didn't require priests. They didn't require fear. They required only that you remember. And so, the suppression began. Declared heretical by the early church, dismissed as pagan fantasy by theologians, burned, hidden, distorted, forgotten. By the 4th century, the Hermetic schools had disappeared. By the Middle Ages, only fragments remained, locked away in monastery libraries, stripped of context, mistranslated, or mocked. But a truth like this never truly dies. It goes underground. It survives in symbols, in architecture, in whispered teachings passed from soul to soul. And then, centuries later, something stirred again. In 1460, a monk arrived in Florence bearing ancient Greek manuscripts. Among them, the Corpus Hermeticum. Cosimo de' Medici, one of the most powerful men of the Italian Renaissance, immediately ordered Marsilio Ficino, his most trusted scholar, to abandon his work on Plato and begin translating Hermes at once. Think about that. In an age rediscovering the glory of ancient philosophy, Hermes was prioritized above Plato, because Ficino, and many others, believed that these texts contained the primordial theology, not a religion, but a universal gnosis, a transmission that predates dogma, transcends culture, and speaks directly to the human spirit. For a brief moment, Hermetic light returned to Europe. Philosophers and mystics were electrified. Artists encoded Hermetic symbolism into their work. Alchemists and astrologers found in the corpus a validation of their craft. The language of as above, so below entered the bloodstream of the West. But the Church was watching, and it did not approve. By the 1600s, Hermetic thought was under attack again. The Inquisition silenced or executed those who spoke too freely. Giordano Bruno, deeply influenced by Hermetic ideas, was burned alive for proclaiming an infinite universe infused with divine intelligence. The Corpus Hermeticum was again labeled dangerous, foolish, heretical. By the time of the Enlightenment, it had been relegated to the shadows, dismissed by historians, buried by theologians, and forgotten by the masses. But it never stopped calling. In the 19th century, occultists rediscovered it. In the 20th, Carl Jung studied its symbols, recognizing in them the architecture of the human psyche. And in the 21st century, now, it returns again, not through institutions, but through intuition, because the text never needed validation. It only needed a reader who was ready. And maybe that reader is you. You who always felt there was something missing. You who saw through the cracks in the stories you were told. You who sensed a memory deeper than this life. You didn't find the Corpus Hermeticum by accident. It found you, because it recognized something ancient in you that's waking up again. And that's what makes this journey forbidden. Not because it's evil, not because it's false, but because it's liberating. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It tells you where to look. It doesn't give you answers. It initiates your own questions. It doesn't create followers. It calls forth sovereignty. That's why it was buried. That's why it was mocked. That's why it was burned. Because once you know the truth of your being, you cannot be controlled. You don't need permission. You don't need validation. You don't need fear. You need only to remember. And that memory is encoded in every word of this text. That's why the Corpus Hermeticum is not just a book. It's a mirror, a map, a flame. And now that it's found its way to your awareness, where the question is no longer, why was it hidden? The question is, what will you do with it now? Because truth cannot be unseen. Remembrance cannot be reversed. And once Hermes speaks within you, there is no going back. In every sacred tradition there is a moment, a single crystalline moment when the veil parts. It is not a ceremony, it is not a sermon, it is an encounter. And in the Corpus Hermeticum, that moment arrives like a lightning bolt in the silence of the soul. The text does not begin with rules or history. It does not open with doctrine or mythology. It begins with something much more intimate, a mystical experience so raw, so profound, that it cannot be reduced to metaphor. This is the beginning of the Poimandres, the first and most powerful book in the Hermetic collection, and it opens like this. My mind was completely concentrated on the things that are, and my thoughts soared aloft. Suddenly, a being of immense magnitude and limitless height appeared before me, and called me by name. Already the tone is unmistakable. This is not a teacher meeting a student. This is consciousness meeting itself. This being, this luminous presence, is not a god in the traditional sense. It does not demand worship. It does not offer commandments. It offers something far more terrifying, absolute truth. The being identifies itself as Poimandres, the mind of all mastery, the divine mind, the nous. It is not outside the universe. It is the fabric of the universe. It is not above us. It is within us. And when Hermes hears it speak, something ancient stirs in him. Not confusion, not fear, but recognition. He is not being taught something new. He is being reminded of something eternal. Poimandres says, I know what you desire. I am with you everywhere. What follows is not a conversation. It is a transmission, a download of cosmic memory, a metaphysical unveiling of the structure of reality. Hermes sees the birth of creation, not in metaphor, but in vision. He witnesses the primal darkness, the divine light that emerges, the word, or logos, resonating through chaos, organizing, aligning, creating. This is not allegory. This is cosmogenesis, Hermetic style. And in this vision, Poimandres reveals something that forever changes the meaning of human. You are not a creature. You are a creator. You are not a sinner. You are a mirror of the divine, crafted not from dust but from mind. In this cosmology, the human is not the lowest rung in the chain of being. The human is the bridge between the visible and the invisible, the axis between matter and spirit. Poimandres speaks of the anthropos, the archetypal human being born of divine mind, endowed with creative power, free will, and radiant intelligence. And this anthropos, filled with love for its creator, chooses to descend into the realm of matter, not as a punishment but as an act of love and longing, to experience, to express, to awaken from within. But something happens in the descent. The soul forgets. It becomes entangled in form. It becomes identified with the body, with sensation, with reaction. It mistakes the mask for the face, the dream for reality. And that's where we find ourselves now, not in exile, but in amnesia. This is the Hermetic view of the human condition, not fallen, but asleep. And the purpose of the teachings is not salvation, it is remembrance. Poimandres tells Hermes that when the soul is ready, it begins the process of return. This return is not a rejection of the world. It is a purification of perception. The soul upon death or through inner alchemy ascends through 7 spheres, shedding illusions. The illusion of physical desire, the illusion of manipulation, the illusion of arrogance, the illusion of grief and emotional chaos, the illusion of false ambition, the illusion of ignorance, the illusion of deception and domination. Each sphere is not just celestial, it is psychological. It is the journey inward, through shadow, through trauma, through identity, toward clarity, toward stillness, toward truth. And only when these layers are dissolved does the soul become light again. Does it become nous again? Does it merge, not with a god in the sky, but with the source that has always lived within it? Poimandres tells Hermes, if you remember this, you will return to life. If not, you will be confused and led astray. This is not a threat. It is a description, because the truth is, we are all returning. The only difference is whether we resist or surrender. Hermes, overwhelmed by the revelation, says, I am now illumined. I see the truth of all that is. I have become mind. This again is the great reversal of Hermetic teaching. You are not here to be told what to believe. You are here to remember what you are, and what you are is not a mindless creature trapped in flesh. You are nous in form. Divine consciousness pretending to be a person for the sake of its own awakening. The implications of this are staggering. It means that prayer is not begging, it is alignment. It means that creation is not external, it is mental. It means that transformation is not moral, it is vibrational. Poimandres is not content to leave Hermes inspired. He charges him with a mission. Write what you have seen. Share it with those who are ready. But know this, many will mock you. Many will fear this truth. And so Hermes writes, not to convert, but to ignite. Because truth cannot be argued into someone. It must be remembered from within. And that is what this text does. It is not a message. It is a mirror. It reflects the divine spark sleeping inside your being. And when you read it, not just with your eyes but with your heart, you begin to remember. You remember that reality is not objective. It is a projection of consciousness. You remember that time is not linear. It is a spiral. You remember that fear is not natural, it is learned. And most of all, you remember that love is not an emotion. It is the essence of creation itself. Poimandres teaches that we are not here to worship the divine. We are here to become it, not through effort, but through awakening. And that awakening begins with stillness, with silence, with the radical act of listening, not to noise but to the space behind it. That is where the voice still speaks. That is where the light still burns. That is where the divine mind still lives. Not in books, not in temples, but in you, in the quiet between breaths, in the ache beneath longing, in the flicker of intuition that says, this is not all there is. So let Poimandres speak. Let it tear through the illusions. Let it dissolve the boundaries. Let it awaken the truth you've always carried, because you are not just a reader of these teachings, you are their continuation. And the moment you realize that, the light returns. What if the pain you carry isn't a punishment, but a portal? What if every wound, every longing, every moment of disorientation in this world is not proof that you're lost, but evidence that you came from somewhere else? The Corpus Hermeticum does not shy away from this mystery. It doesn't ask us to bypass it. It asks us to look directly at the path our soul has taken, from the heights of divine light to the dense shadows of material life. This is the sacred descent. The plunge from the nous, the divine mind, into form, not as exile, not as sin, but as mission. To descend is not to fall, it is to forget, for the purpose of remembering more deeply. In the Hermetic vision, the soul is not born out of nothingness. It is begotten by the divine mind, a spark of infinite intelligence wrapped in luminous consciousness. But something happens when that soul gazes upon the cosmos. It sees the beauty of creation and desires to experience it. It sees the stars, the movement of the spheres, the glimmer of individuality, and so, the descent begins. The Poimandres tells us, the human being, having seen the beauty of the world and having been in love with it, wanted to dwell in it. And nature, seeing the beauty of the human being, reached out to him and embraced him. It is a story of attraction, a cosmic magnetism. The soul chooses embodiment not out of ignorance, but out of love. This is where the Hermetic path departs from doctrines of shame. The body is not evil. The earth is not a trap. Even desire in its purest form is not a flaw. They are all part of the initiation. But something happens during that embrace between soul and matter. The soul begins to forget. It becomes entangled, enchanted, overwhelmed by sensation, identity, reaction. It mistakes the role for the self, the costume for the actor, the dream for the dreamer. This forgetting is the true spiritual crisis. Not suffering, not mistakes, but the loss of memory. Because when you forget who you are, you become vulnerable to anything that tells you who you should be. You begin to chase validation. You begin to fear death. You begin to obey systems that have no love for your essence. And so the soul, once sovereign, becomes fragmented. You begin to identify with the body, as if it is the whole. You begin to react to life rather than respond from presence. You begin to collect labels, titles, traumas, until you no longer remember the light beneath them. And here is the great paradox. This forgetting is not failure. It is the necessary darkness before the return of light. In Hermetic philosophy, the soul must descend in order to rise transformed, Not to escape matter, but to spiritualize it, because every part of the human experience, the pain, the longing, the loss, is fertile soil for awakening. Each heartbreak becomes a doorway, each frustration, a riddle, each desire, a teacher. The soul does not ascend by avoiding these. It ascends by passing through them with awareness, by turning every shadow into a mirror, by asking not, "Why is this happening to me?" but "What in me is ready to awaken through this?" And this is where the Corpus Hermeticum becomes revolutionary. It does not ask you to leave the world. It asks you to redeem it, not through judgment, but through presence. Not by fixing everything around you, but by illuminating what is within you. Because the descent is not only individual, it is collective. We are all part of a great migration. Souls entering this plane of existence to remember themselves, through relationships, through challenge, through mystery. And many forget. But some begin to remember. It might begin as a whisper, "This isn't who I really am," or as a longing, "There must be more to life than this," or as a rupture, a breakdown, an illness, a moment when the surface shatters and the deeper world reveals itself. These are the turning points, the secret thresholds where the soul begins its ascent, not upwards in space, but inward, toward the source. And that path is marked not by dogma but by direct experience. The Hermetic tradition tells us that as the soul begins to wake up, it regains access to the faculties it once possessed. The power of discernment, the vision of the heart, the inner hearing that recognizes truth not by logic but by resonance. You begin to notice synchronicities. You begin to feel the energy behind words, not just their meaning. You begin to listen to silence more than noise. And slowly, the memories return, not in the form of linear stories but in waves of knowing. You realize that you've been here before, that the stars are familiar, that the teachings you're discovering feel like home. This is the alchemy of descent. It turns pain into wisdom. It transforms forgetting into remembering. It sanctifies the human experience as the very womb of the divine. You are not broken. You are becoming. You are not lost. You are in the middle of a sacred spiral, and every step down has carved the depth from which your light now rises. But here's the most important truth of this part of the journey. You do not rise alone. Every time a soul remembers itself, it ripples into the collective. Every act of remembrance becomes a light on the path for others. Every healed wound becomes a doorway for someone else's awakening. Because we are not separate beings climbing separate ladders. We are one field of divine mind, fractaled into infinite experiences, all remembering together. And so the descent was never a fall. It was a planting. You are the seed. And now, the light is calling you up from the soil. You don't need to escape the world. You need to see it clearly. You need to walk it as the soul you truly are, not the persona you've been conditioned to perform. Because this is what it means to be hermetically awakened, not to believe in a better world, but to become the consciousness that births it. And from this depth, the next phase emerges. Because after remembering the descent, comes the sacred ascent, and with it, the reactivation of the divine powers that have always lived inside you. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the soul buried for lifetimes beneath noise finally exhales. It doesn't happen in a cathedral. It doesn't require incense or chants or sacred texts. It happens when you remember, not with your mind, but with your being. And in the Hermetic path, this is the turning point, the great reversal, where descent ends and ascent begins, where forgetting gives way to divine memory, where the soul, like a sunken star rising from the depths, begins to reclaim its radiance, not by becoming something new, but by remembering what it always was. In the Corpus Hermeticum, this phase is not described as a conquest. It is not a struggle against darkness. It is a return, slow, sacred, sovereign. The journey upward is not linear. It is spiral. It mirrors the architecture of galaxies, the movement of breath, the geometry of awakening. And its purpose is not to escape Earth, but to resurrect within it, to bring the divine fully into form. This is the true Hermetic ascent. You don't become something else. You become transparent to the light already pulsing through you. You become aligned with the frequency of the news, the divine mind that once seeded your soul and now calls it home. But what does this actually look like? It begins with a shift in perception. Where you once saw random events, you begin to see choreography. Where you once felt fragmented, you begin to feel integrated. Where you once reacted from fear, you begin to respond from presence. And that presence is magnetic. You notice it in your relationships. Old dynamics fall away. New connections feel like reunions. You notice it in your body. You treat it not as a tool of survival, but as a temple of frequency. You notice it in your speech. You no longer speak to convince. You speak to resonate. This is not a fantasy. This is the tangible effect of spiritual ascent. It is not glamorous. It is often quiet, solitary, even painful, because every layer of false identity must dissolve, and the deeper you remember, the more illusions burn. You might lose friends. You might feel untethered. You might be misunderstood, mocked, left behind. But that too is initiation. The Hermetic ascent is not about gaining approval. It is about reclaiming sovereignty. And sovereignty means you no longer live according to the expectations of others. You live from the knowing of your own soul. You begin to walk differently, not in arrogance, but in alignment. And here's where the most subtle transformation occurs. Your mind stops being your master. It becomes your mirror. In Hermetic thought, the mind is not an obstacle. It is the interface, but only when it is tuned. Only when it is emptied of noise, softened by silence, and aligned with the frequency of the divine. This is when the voice of the news returns, not as thought, but as intuition, not as rules, but as rhythm. And you begin to live in harmony with that rhythm. You begin to feel the tides of the invisible. You begin to trust the pull of your own knowing, more than the logic of the world. This is inner resurrection, and it is not symbolic. It is cellular. Your biology shifts. Your nervous system recalibrates. Your breath deepens. Your heart field expands. You become a tuning fork for divine frequency, a vessel of clarity in a world clouded by confusion. And here's the mystery. This resurrection is not just personal. It is cosmic. Because as you remember, the universe remembers through you. You become the place where spirit incarnates. You become the new temple, not made of stone, but of silence and presence and living awareness. In the Corpus Hermeticum, this stage is described not as enlightenment, but as a return to unity, where the one and the many are no longer seen as opposites, but as reflections of the same eternal pattern. The seeker dissolves into the seen. The knower dissolves into the knowing. The self dissolves into the all. And yet, you remain. You remain as a point of awareness, as a node in the infinite web, as a unique expression of the whole. This is not annihilation. It is sacred individuation. You are not lost in the sea of unity. You become the wave that remembers it is water. And from that awareness, a new kind of service emerges. Not service rooted in guilt or duty, but service as natural overflow. You become a carrier of remembrance, a walking vibration of clarity, a presence that awakens others, not by preaching but by being, because awakening is contagious, not in the way of doctrine, but in the way of fire. When one soul burns with the memory of the divine, others feel the heat. They remember too. This is how Hermetic wisdom spreads, not through empires, but through hearts, not through institutions, but through initiates. And the world begins to shift, not because it was forced, but because truth resonated. This is the true alchemy, not turning lead into gold, but turning trauma into wisdom, fear into faith, separation into sacred service. And it all begins with ascent, not as a fantasy of escape, but as a lived embodiment of the highest truth, that the divine was never outside you, that the path was never away from the world, but deeper into it. You came here to remember, to descend and rise again, not as victim, not as ego, but as presence embodied. You are the resurrection. You are the remembering. You are the rhythm of return. And the moment you stop chasing light outside of you and start revealing it within, the illusion breaks. What was hidden becomes clear. What was separate becomes whole. And the soul stands tall again, not above the world, but in it. Awake, radiant, ready to walk the path not of belief, but of being. The true test of any spiritual teaching isn't how beautiful it sounds in silence, but how powerfully it transforms your everyday life. The Corpus Hermeticum is not just a text to be studied, it is a frequency to be lived, and the final revelation of its wisdom is this: divinity is not a concept to believe in, it is a practice, a posture, a presence you carry into every moment, because awakening isn't something that happens once. It happens again and again, every time you choose to remember who you are in the middle of forgetting, every time you pause before reacting, every time you speak from truth instead of fear, every time you hold yourself with compassion instead of judgment. These are not small things, they are initiations. Daily, humble, invisible, but real. This is what it means to live hermetically. Not to escape the world, but to walk through it as a vessel of the divine mind, as a bearer of sacred frequency in ordinary moments. You brush your teeth with awareness. You speak to the cashier with presence. You feel your emotions without collapsing into them. You ask yourself not, "What should I do?" but "What does the divine in me already know?" This is where the Corpus Hermeticum becomes embodied. The teachings are no longer separate from your breath, your choices, your interactions. You are not just a reader of wisdom. You become its continuation, and the practice is not about perfection, it is about remembrance. You will forget, you will fall asleep again, you will lose yourself in the illusions of the world, but the difference now is that you know how to return to stillness, return to alignment, return to the frequency of your own soul, and in that return, you radiate something that can't be taught in words, only transmitted through presence. People feel it. They may not understand it, but they will be moved by it, because when you are aligned with the divine mind, you become a mirror that reminds others of their own light, and slowly, silently, you help reweave the world, not through force, but through frequency, not by preaching, but by being. You become the new temple, not made of stone or doctrine, but of flesh and breath and daily devotion. You are the altar. You are the flame. This is what Hermes invites us into, a life that is not divided into sacred and secular, but lived as one seamless act of remembering. You walk as a mystic in the grocery store. You pray through the way you hold space for others. You chant not with words, but with the rhythm of your regulated nervous system. Your silence becomes scripture. Your gaze becomes medicine. Your presence becomes initiation, and the world responds. Not immediately, not always visibly, but deeply. The chaos begins to make sense. The pain begins to reveal its teaching. The joy begins to feel less like a fleeting high, and more like a natural state. Because when you live hermetically, you are no longer seeking miracles. You realize you are one. You are the evidence that remembrance is possible. You are the testimony that awakening can happen right here, in this body, in this breath. And that is the most radical teaching of the Corpus Hermeticum. You don't need to transcend this world. You need to transfigure it. You don't need to become more divine, you need to become more you. Because who you really are, beneath the layers, is already divine, already radiant, already whole. Your practice is to let that truth be seen, felt, expressed, and when it is, the entire field shifts. Because consciousness is not isolated, it is collective, and when one soul rises in remembrance, it sends ripples through the matrix of forgetting. Others begin to stir, others begin to ask deeper questions, others begin to feel the pull, that sacred ache, that whisper of something more, that familiar ancient call to wake up. And so your path becomes more than personal. It becomes service, not service through sacrifice, but through self-realization. You don't need to fix everyone. You just need to embody the frequency that heals. You don't need to fight the darkness. You just need to radiate your light. And that light is not a metaphor. It is a real, measurable, living vibration. It pulses through your cells when you breathe with presence. It emanates from your heart when you live in coherence. It shapes your reality when your thoughts are aligned with soul. This is not theory. This is energetic law. And when you align with it, you don't just change your life. You become a catalyst for the transformation of the entire field. This is the invitation. This is the gift. This is the burden and the blessing. To live as an awakened being in a world built on forgetting. To walk as an emissary of the one mind through the dream of separation. To remember, again and again, that every moment is a portal, every breath is a choice, every encounter is an altar. You don't need to retreat into the mountains, you don't need to wait for the perfect conditions. You just need to be here, fully, with your heart open, your mind clear, your soul listening. Because in the end, the greatest Hermetic teaching is not hidden in the text, it is hidden in you. And as you walk this path, not perfectly but faithfully, you will become what Hermes always knew you were, a living transmission, a reminder, a bridge between worlds, a spark of the divine in human form. You are not just a student of this wisdom, you are its continuation, and the world is waiting. If this transmission has stirred something ancient in you, if you feel the resonance vibrating beneath your skin, if you know deep down that you've walked this path before, then you're not alone. This channel is a home for remembrance, for mystics, seekers, initiates of the invisible. There are more transmissions waiting for you. Dive deeper with our other videos. Explore the series. Let the fire keep growing. And if you feel called to support this work, you can find the link to buy me a coffee in the description. Not because you have to, but because you remember, and remembrance wants to be shared. Why does an obscure text written in a forgotten language, hidden from the eyes of empires and excluded from sacred canons, still call to us across millennia? Why does the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of mystical dialogues birthed in the twilight of ancient civilizations, still whisper to souls in this fractured age? Because the flame it carries was never meant to die. The world we inhabit today, this modern maze of noise, algorithms, distractions, and disconnection, is not as different from the ancient world as we might think. The outer trappings have changed. We've traded temples for screens, elders for influencers, myths for memes. But the soul's longing, it hasn't moved an inch. We still ache for the same truth. We still yearn for the same belonging. We still seek the same light behind the veil. And the Corpus Hermeticum answers that yearning, not by giving us a doctrine to obey, but by giving us a doorway to enter, a doorway inward, a doorway to remembrance. At first glance, the teachings might seem archaic. They speak of the one mind, of divine emanations, of cosmic order. But beneath the symbols lies something universal, something timeless. The same truths that guided the initiates of ancient Kemet, the philosophers of Alexandria, the mystics of the Renaissance, are still pulsing inside you. And the most radical truth of the Hermetic path is this: you don't need to change the world. You need to remember who you are within it, because when you do, the world changes through you. The systems of this world, religious, political, economic, have long thrived on the illusion that truth must be mediated. That access to the divine requires hierarchy, obedience, guilt. Hermes Trismegistus shattered that illusion. He didn't write from a mountaintop. He didn't ask for followers. He whispered directly to the soul, "All is mind. You are mind. And the world you see is shaped by the thoughts you hold." This is not metaphor. This is metaphysics. You are not a passive observer of reality. You are a participant, a projector, a co-creator. And this knowing, when lived, not just believed, frees you. It frees you from the victim story. It frees you from the trance of external validation. It frees you from the constant craving for something more. Because when you remember, you no longer seek. You become the flame. And this is why the Corpus Hermeticum still matters. Not because it's historically important, but because it is energetically alive. Every line you read, every phrase you contemplate, is encoded, not with data, but with vibration, with the frequency of awakening. It doesn't just inform, it transforms. That's why it's dangerous. Not because it promotes rebellion, but because it dissolves dependence. The Hermetic initiate is not a sheep, not a follower, but a sovereign flame, capable of discerning truth not by consensus but by inner resonance. In a world obsessed with external authority, this is the ultimate heresy, and yet it is the path of liberation, because when enough souls remember, the world reorders itself, not through violence, but through frequency, not through ideology, but through embodiment. The Corpus Hermeticum doesn't ask you to preach, it asks you to become the teachings, to carry the vibration of clarity into confusion, to speak with the authority of one who has met the self, to live not in reaction to fear but in service to the sacred. This is what the world needs now. Not more content, not more outrage, not more noise. It needs aligned humans. It needs mystics in the grocery store, magicians in the workplace, Shamans disguised as mothers and fathers and artists and engineers. It needs you, not as a savior, but as a reminder that wholeness is possible, that coherence is real, that divinity was never lost. It was just hidden under layers of conditioning. And when you carry that remembrance, you become part of a lineage that spans time and tradition, a lineage of those who dared to see clearly, to feel deeply, to speak from the soul. Hermes spoke to the initiates of his age, but he also spoke through time, to us, to this moment, to this crossroads, to this tipping point in human evolution. And the question he offers now is simple and terrifying. Will you remember? Not just intellectually, not just emotionally, but viscerally, practically, devotionally. Will you choose to live as if your thoughts shape reality? Will you walk as if your breath carries sacred frequency? Will you honor your body as a temple of the divine mind? Because the world isn't waiting for another theory. It's waiting for you. You, the you beneath the masks. The you that knows silence more intimately than speech. The you that remembers fire. You are not here to survive. You are here to resurrect the sacred. Through your art, through your presence, through your unwavering refusal to abandon your own light. This is the final transmission of the Corpus Hermeticum, that the divine didn't come to you from outside. It has always been moving through you, and your task is not to find it, but to remove everything that blocks its flow, to clear the channel, to live the truth, to burn with remembrance. And as you do, the veils lift, the world responds, and you realize the most miraculous thing of all, that the book you were reading was always reading you. The teachings were not new, they were you, reflected back, encrypted in symbol, waiting to be claimed. So claim them, not just with your eyes, but with your life, and let that life become scripture. Let your choices become sacred geometry. Let your silence become sanctuary. Let your presence become prophecy. This is the real legacy of the Corpus Hermeticum, not ink on parchment, but fire in the soul, and now it lives in you. If this video spoke to something ancient in you, if you felt more than just words, if you felt the pull, then know this: you're not alone. You've entered a current. You've remembered a frequency. You've come home to a lineage that spans stars. Keep going. There's more. Explore the other videos in this Hermetic series. Let the teachings unfold you. Let the flame grow brighter. And if you feel called to support this work, to help us carry this ancient fire into the future, you can find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Your presence here already means more than you know, and the remembrance has only just begun.